First of all, I'd like to thank all my friends from Sakura for letting me be a part of this. And next, I'd like to thank each and every one of you ladies and gentlemen out there for taking time out of what I know you have a busy day to check in with us. So as you can see, I am here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I'm checking in, and it is 1 o'clock here. So I'll say good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And just like Joshua said, we are going to talk today on H&E staining, consistency, and reproducibility. Now, he mentioned something about the fact that I had spent decades with H&Es, and I'm not sure if that's a compliment or if he really thinks that I'm old. I'm just not sure. But anyway, just how much time have I spent with H&Es? Well, I went to a formal school of histotechnology after my first year of junior college. It was combined with classes at Georgia State University, and about the end of 1969, I finished that, so I guess that tells you that I am over 40, but barely. About 1970, I received my ASCP registration. My first job was at Yerkes Primate Research Center in University, Atlanta, Georgia. Great job. Then I moved to Florida, had a couple of kids first, then moved to Florida. Spent 15 years managing a small histopathology lab, which grew to a ginormous histopathology lab during those 15 years at Florida Hospital, Orlando. Then I spent 19 years with an industry leader, the last 13 of those as the marketing manager and so-called staining expert, in quotes, for North America, where I retired from in 2013. During those 13 years, I averaged being in 1 to 3 laboratories across North America every week. I saw a lot of staining done. I saw a lot of great staining. I saw a lot of problematic staining. So this is really where I received a lot of what I would say was my real life experience with the H&E stain. Now I actually own a one-person company. I'm that one person, and I've been 2 years plus with Creative Histology Consulting, mostly consulting about staining. So one time I had to try to explain some non-technical salespeople exactly how important the H&E was, because they had been led to believe that all the fancy IHC, special stains, molecular biology, all this was really what was happening in the world of pathology. And they didn't care to spend a lot of time, dealing with the basics. So I put together this little staining food groups, and if you notice that right in the middle of the plate is the H&E, which is the meat and potatoes of the histopathology lab. If you're a vegetarian, then that would be your soy patty and whatever you like to eat with it. But the H&E is the basis where it all starts. And once you understand that, you can't live without it. So there are some general statements that we can make about the H&E. It's the most often requested stain by a pathologist. Many factors influence the quality of the H&E, and it is possibly the most misunderstood stain in histology. And maybe I'll share some of these things with you as we go through this process today, because during those 13 years of being out in all kinds of laboratories, from small to huge to ginormous, I learned that it's a very misunderstood stain. One thing I want to interject here is I'm going to be talking solid for about 45 minutes, and I know that you might come up with some points of contention or something you might like to say about it. So just jot that down, and you'll have a chance to ask those questions at the end. Now, here's something that I hope you agree with me, having spent your time in laboratories with the people we call pathologists. The difference between a good and a bad H&E is sometimes simply which pathologist is looking at it. There are 80-year-old doctors who could look at slides that have been stained with black ink and tell you what it is. And then some of our newer doctors need more structure, they need more clarity. So oftentimes it's frustrating, but oftentimes this is the key to your success with an H&E, is the pathologist looking at it. what are we supposed to see from an H&E? What's it supposed to do? Traditional responses for hematoxylin will say, well, it demonstrates nuclear detail, so nuclear membranes, nucleoli, chromatin. We want to see it in the open and the dense nuclei. Nuclei are normally blue to bluish purple, nuclei are, and nucleoli are normally reddish purple if well differentiated. What about eosin? Traditional responses would say that the eosin differentiates between collagen, muscle, red blood cells, eosinophilic granules. But the most important thing is that it provides great contrast with the nuclear detail so that your pathologist can look at very low power and see if he sees anything questionable, if there might be something wrong with this sample. So that's what traditionally people would say about eosin. Now, I formulated that if this was a perfect world, that we should be able to come up with some figures, stick figures, and make a formula that says, okay, if we do this every single day, every time, we will get consistent and reproducible H&Es every time. Unfortunately, a map like this doesn't exist. However, we are hoping by the end of this session that we have a formula that you can use to achieve consistent and reproducible H&Es. But it's not going to be done this way. What does any pathologist want from his or her H&Es? Isn't that the age-old question that we've been asking forever and ever? Well, I asked the pathologist, what do you want, really? And they said, hey, I want the secrets of a tissue sample to be given up to me. In other words, I want to see everything that I should see in that sample. And all the sections of the same tissue, whether on the same slide or on separate slides, should all look the same. In other words, I want consistency in visual clarity, consistency in quality. The first slide of the day and the last slide of the day, I would like for them to look the same. I want you to reproduce the stain in the morning, reproduce the same thing in the afternoon, and the same thing on the following morning. I don't want them to look different shades every day. Staining quality should be the same from day to day. Visually clear samples that look consistent throughout the sections and slides and are reproducible from batch to batch, day to day. Now, that's what they're asking of us. Is this your pathologist when receiving slides? Is he happy? Have you got it down all the time? I hope so. I personally never had one like that. This was more like what I was used to. I was used to some unhappy pathologists with some complaints. Their normal complaints range from, I can't see into the nuclei. There's blue background on the slide. Goblet cells look too blue. The eosin's falling out of my slides. The slides were much better before lunch. Now they're too pale. There's some areas that has no nuclear stain. And the one that I love the most is bottom sections are stained darker than the ones on top. And this is usually where we will call our people who sold us our automatic stainer, and we will say, hey, your stainer's not working because the bottom sections are stained darker than the ones on top. That's a problem to really work through, and typically doesn't involve the stainer, but, you know, automation creates its own caveats. Okay, this is what I used to feel like after the pathologist came in and told me the slides were better before lunch. He told me that the background was too dark. I just wanted to pull my hair out and cry. But, of course, we don't. What we do is we go on. So to get that consistent, reproducible stain, we got to start at the beginning. There are just some forces that affect staining quality, things that you have no control over, like the handling of specimens after removal of the body, crushing with forceps, drying out before placing fixatives, cauterized, necrotic samples. You can't stop that all the time. You can have a conversation with your surgeons and your physicians, and hopefully that'll help. There are other forces that you typically can have some control over. Fixation, the proper fixative, adequate time in the fixative, the correct volume. If it's a huge specimen, put a bunch on it. Things that you also have control over are processing protocols. If you have a fatty piece of tissue that has been grossed and it absolutely fills the cassette, and you get a beautiful section from that, from your processing, then your little biopsies are going to be crispy critters. So if you get one thing done correctly, then some other things might suffer. So size and nature of tissue is critical to creating your processing protocols. And if you start up front and get those right, it's going to look much better on the other end as it comes out of your H&E stain. Here's a sample of a piece of tissue, and this is really fine art, so don't laugh at it too much. I couldn't find what I wanted. But this demonstrates what a well-formalin fixed piece of tissue should look like. It has structure, the hydrophobic bonds are formed, and we've got some free-floating water, and we've got some bound water, which helps the structure to maintain its, its architecture. So that's a good formalin fixation, So when we dehydrate it, after we're fixed, after our tissue's fixed, it goes on the instrument, we've got to get that water out. So this so-called removal of free water is dehydration. But we don't want to remove the tissue that's bound to the tissue component, or the water that's bound to the tissue components, just within the spaces, and that's the term proper dehydration. Dehydration is diffusion, where inward passage of alcohol and outward flow of water occur until at some point the alcohol and water reach equilibrium, leaving 3 to 4% of free water still in the tissue. This means you've got good structure left in your tissue, you've got 3 to 4% of your free water, and you've got your bound water still there. And your tissue is going to look super. You're going to be able to see through the nuclei, the coloration is going to be good. So if we remove the bound water, and the rest of the free water for that matter, what we end up with is a crushed structure. It looks very much like the structure that occurs when you don't give it enough formalin fixation and your tissue becomes alcohol fixed. It's denatured and it breaks down the structure. This is just a very compressed version of this slide, but your compressed version doesn't allow you to see or to have that visual clarity that the doctors want if you don't have this structure when you cut the section. Here's an example of overdehydration. Anyone in the audience ever seen anything like this? It's some kind of a gastric biopsy. It's got a lot of chatter, but most of that chatter is caused from the fact that it is overdehydrated. It's got a very basophilic staining in the background because that's what overdehydrated tissues tend to do. And so probably what this individual did was take that block off, soak it in some ice water, and try to sneak up on it so that they could get a couple of sections that would be, thin enough and without all of this chatter, so that they could turn that into their pathologist. Now, in this example, if you were doing levels on a slide or several slides, you could easily have thick and thin slides giving the impression that you had uneven staining, which in fact, it wasn't uneven staining at all. So that problem needs to be fixed at processing. Now, microtomy. You typically have control over your microtome. If you're still using something like this, I think I would sell it as a boat anchor and get myself a new automatic microtome, or at least something that controls the microns a little bit better. So you can control, in many cases, compression, chattering, blade marks, thick and thin, by your blade and by your microtome. If your tissue is compressed during processing, you can't help that. All you can do is take the best sample that you can from that. So from processing, we want to take away the idea that every tissue sample is special. If it's tiny, it needs a tiny protocol. If it's huge, it needs a huge protocol to get the job done properly. From microtomy, you can take away that there are things you can do to stop micro chatter, which makes for a pretty lousy looking slide. But one big thing you can take away is that if you have a piece of tissue that's in a block and it looks like this, and your slide that you make should look like that also. You should be able to take this slide, hold it over that block, and say, yep, that is, you know, the right size tissue. If that tissue is that size and your slide looks like this, that's not processing. That's something that happened on the microtome. So the takeaway from this is get a sharper blade, get your block colder, and get all those cells laid out nice and neat so that they don't hold out any secrets when the pathologist looks at it. So what makes an H&E work? Well, in the next few slides, we're just going to analyze an H&E and highlight what's important in each step of the process so that we can kind of pick out what the problem areas are and see what we can do about them. Okay, so the staining process consists of, as you well know, deparaffinization, hydration, staining, dehydration, and clearing. It's just this process backwards and forwards because, you know, on a processor, we work very hard to get it dehydrated so that we can get the paraffin in it. Now we're going to work very hard to get the paraffin out of it. Then, because we're going to an aqueous staining solution, we need to take our sections to water so that they're in a friendly solution when they go into hematoxin. So the staining occurs. Then, of course, we've got to get the water out of it so that we can clear it, cover slip it, and have beautiful sections for the pathologist to look at. Now, typically, when we are cutting our tissue, we'll load them in a rack or we'll put them in some vessel that we can either hand stain them or we can move them to an automatic stainer. Now, after microscopy, you want to dry them in an oven. This says 65 to 70 degrees. It doesn't say 90 to 100 degrees centigrade. It should be around this temperature for 15 to 20 minutes. I know people microwave, and that works well. Honestly, I still don't understand how it does, but it works okay. But if you're doing conventional ovens, you want it 65 to 70 for 15 to 20 minutes, long enough so that the tissue will adhere to the slide, won't fall off during staining, and the paraffin will begin to melt around the tissue samples. Now, one thing that I have seen more than one time, it's happened in my own laboratory, is nuclear bubbling or ghosting of nuclei, where you have absolutely nothing in the middle of your cells to tell the pathologist whether this is a normal specimen or not. It is a catastrophe when you have a load of tissue that has a couple hundred slides with nuclear bubbling. This can occur in several places, but one of the places it can occur is if you leave water under here, you dry them too high, the water in the slides under the tissue will steam. It will literally steam, and it will cook your nuclei right out of their spots. So be careful not to do that. Deparaffinization then is the process of getting, after we've got it out of the dryer, we've got it started, we've got to get the rest of it off. And this is done with solutions, either called xylene or xylene substitutes. Lots of articles have been written about the dangers, potential dangers of xylene, and that xylene substitutes, you know, may be healthier. This is not the forum for that argument or whatever, that conversation, but with either of them, you have to handle them slightly different. Xylene, you need 3 changes on your staining rack, 2 to 3 minutes each, and if you are using substitutes, that needs to be longer. And you have to change your substitutes more often because xylene is actually a halfway decent dehydrant. So like on your staining line, when you're running them down through 100% at the end, and you may have a little water left in it, and your xylene is real fresh and clean, it will actually complete that dehydration process as well as clear it. If that is a substitute, it will not do that, and you will end up for sure with water going to your automatic cover slipper or to your hand cover slipper. So just remember, they both do the job, but it takes a little differentiation between the two. So xylene removes the sections. At this point, if you held up a slide, it would appear clear. You would look at it and you couldn't see anything, and that's good. So once we have got the paraffin off of the slides, like I said, we've got to hydrate it to get it into a friendly situation that the hematoxylin will like, so to speak. So the next step is normally a series of 100% alcohols, at least 2. The job of the 100% alcohol is to take the xylene out of the slide. If when your slides leave the last 100% alcohol, it still has xylene in it and it goes into, say, a 95 or whatever you have next, there's going to be water left on that slide. And it's kind of like mixing, oil and water. It'll float. It'll block the hematoxylin from staining it. It's like trying to stain over an oil slick. So you don't want this to happen. So you want to make sure that your 100% is clean and that all the xylene is gone. And a good way to test that is if you use a 95 or even an 80%. In the old days, of course, we felt like the tissue was going to get its feelings hurt if we didn't gradually introduce it to the water. Like if we came from 95 and just plunked it in the water, it would be, it might suffer from it. But that is so not the case, because you can go readily from 95 into water and have no issues from it. But getting back to the point about the xylene, if there is still xylene left in your water, if you have xylene left on your slides, it hits the 95, you're going to get a milky solution. And at that point, it may not look exactly that strong. It may just have little white wisps going through it. But at that point, you're going to want to take it back to 100% alcohol. If you're doing it by hand, if you're doing it by, automation, we'll talk about that in a minute, how we're going to keep that from happening. But you definitely want to take care of that because there's still xylene in it. Now, after this alcohol step, whatever it is, if you want to go to 70, if you want to go to 95, it doesn't matter. We want to introduce it to a water bath, and we want to make sure we get all the alcohol off, because now we're going into that completely aqueous hematoxylin. So if we look at our stains, we all know that hematoxylin comes from a logwood tree now, South American logwood tree. And we also know that if the rainforest and the logwood tree forest get burned down, we have a shortage of hematoxylin, for those of you who are old enough to remember that 10 or 20 years ago. But we are doing something wrong. Our nomenclature isn't exactly right. Hematoxylin is the extracted powder from the logwood tree. So when you buy a bottle of stain, it'll say, staining powder, it will say hematoxylin. Hematin is the product, is the oxidized product. So in fact, we are actually doing hematin and eosin stains. But since we all know it as hematoxylin, we'll just refer to it as that. Now, if we take that hematoxylin and we mix it with some water and we stick some slides in it, nothing's going to happen. But if we combine it with the metallic salts, it becomes one of the best nuclear stains. We call that mordanting. There are other stains that require mordanting, but in this particular case, we use something like aluminum, iron, chromium, and we convert it's used as a mordant. It's a metallic ion bound to a dye that is involved in the binding of the dye to tissue and is referred to as a mordant. Let me show you a picture of that. So here you have your hematin/hematoxylin molecule, and you got your tissue. And they obviously don't fit together. They don't like each other. We add our aluminum salts, and voila, all of a sudden we have got an extremely potent nuclear stain. And they stick together like that, and they don't come apart. So that's how we form it. Back one. There are two mechanisms that are used in the H&E stain: adsorption and absorption. Adsorption is a physical reaction dependent on the dye charge and the material to be stained. The molecules just kind of hang on, and they're loosely held by the surface. Absorption is the passage of one substance into another substance where they're striving to reach equilibrium or saturated. Now, here's an example of adsorption. So here we have eosin, let's say, or some red fluid in the glass. We add a chunk of carbon, which changes its pH. The glass fluid just leaps onto the carbon, and then if we add an accentuator or accelerator, something like heat, well, then we can actually make the red fluid fall off of it. And this is kind of what happens when you're using eosin. If you think about it, and you go from a 95% alcohol or some alcohol into your alcoholic eosin, and then you come out of there and you go into a lower grade alcohol, like 80 or 95%, if you leave it in there too long, your eosin will come out, maybe too much. So that's a sample of how adsorption works in an H&E stain. Absorption, some examples are spraying perfume and it's absorbed by the skin, French fries which get ruined in moisture from the air and they become soggy. Hematoxylin is absorbed by the cell, so that's an example of absorption. And you can think about how it coats the H&E slide, or the tissue on the slide, turns it all blue until it reaches equilibrium. So again, we're going to call this hematoxylin. It's a basic dye. It carries a positive charge. It is attractive to the negative charges of the chromatin, the DNA, and the RNA. Covalent bonds are formed. And this affinity for a basic dye is called basophilia. Now, look at those covalent bonds. If we have two electrons or two atoms and they're bound by covalent bond, they actually share electrons, making both of them at least a half time stronger than they were singularly. Ionic bonds, on the other hand, so hematoxylin is held with covalent bonds, hard to break. Ionic bonding is a weak bond because you're leaving one of your atoms totally defenseless without electrons, and he could be snatched away very easily. Remember ionic bonding because we're going to touch on that in just a couple of slides. So as far as hematoxylin staining, Harris and Mayer, if you notice, will continue to oxidize, and you typically have to filter them every day because they'll have this beautiful gold sheen on top of them, but really makes a mess on the first slides that go through them. So you have to filter them. Gills, on the other hand, oxidizes much slower because it has typically glacial acetic acid to slow it down, and you will rarely have to filter it because of a gold sheen. You may want to filter it just for, cleanliness sake. The new age hematoxins are solutions like hybrid solutions of Harris and Gills, and they don't have to be filtered every day because they don't oxidize fast either. So if you're using Harris, Mayer's is typically mostly used in special stains and or in Europe. If you're using Harris, you will have to filter your hematoxylin daily or even more often. Of course, we all know regressive versus progressive. Now, if I was ever called by a laboratory with a problem and they were telling me that, say, their nuclei were too light, the first thing I would ask them, are you doing a regressive or a progressive stain? And I'm really sad to say that a lot of people had to ask me, what does that mean? So simply put, a regressive stain uses some kind of differentiator like an acid alcohol, and a progressive stain, a technically strict progressive stain, does not use some sort of differentiator. So we'll go into a little bit more. In a regressive method, tissue is overstained and rinsed, and you don't wash out the stain. And you'll note that if you come out of Harris hematoxylin and wash it, it's like every tissue on your slide is all blue. Then you dump it into something that is normally a hydrochloric acid-based alcohol. Then when you pull it out, you notice that most of the blue is gone because there's a strong, HCl is a strong acid, and it breaks the covalent bonds that hold the hematoxylin on. Now, of course, you have to get rid of that acid solution, and it has to be timed kind of perfectly. So you want to dump it in water really quick to get rid of the acid and move on from that step. Now, it's very difficult sometimes you may have experienced this, if you're trying to move from a hand stain to automatic staining. Because when you are hand staining and you're dipping that acid, you're dipping your slides in the acid, and you know it's 1 second, you can do 1 second and then get over to the water and shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, and get that acid off of there really quick and change it into clean water, and you've done a magnificent job, and your tissue looks fantastic. Then you buy an automatic stainer. Oh my gosh, your pathologists are complaining that the slides are too light. The nuclei are too light. The reason they're too light is because you're using your same acid alcohol, your same time and hematoxylin, and the problem is that the handles, the arms in some automatic stainers can't move 1 second fast. So by the time you put your 1 second on the timing clock, you've really spent 4 to 5 seconds in your acid alcohol, and it's virtually wiped out all of your hematoxylin. The way you have to fix that is you have to dilute your acid alcohol. You may have to go 0.5% or 0.25%. But that's how you have to fix it, to go back and get that same quality. And then you've always got to dip in your water when you're using automation. Now, at this point in time, another slide will show this. I want to tell you what technically differentiation is, the step where the acid alcohol attacks, remember the tissue mordant and the mordant dye linkages that we just made? Well, the acid alcohol attacks that someplace. And honestly, I can't find anywhere in the literature where anybody knows exactly where it's attacked. But it's either cut off here at the tissue or cut off here at the hematoxylin. Either way, this falls apart and you no longer have nuclear staining. If you do that too much, like I said, you will lose all of your nuclear staining. At this point, when it comes from the acid alcohol, and this is very important to remember, if you've ever had your pathologist say, oh man, the nuclei look red, okay? Well, at this point, in this acid pH, the hematoxylin becomes red. It also becomes soluble. It won't wash out in water, but it will definitely wash out in alcohol. So not only, if you leave it in this situation, will it be red, it will also not be very strong because most of it will wash out. So it's crucial at this stage that you remove the acid really quick. That's why I say go to, I guess that's all in there. It's critical to remove it. So that's why it's best on your automated instrument to turn the dips on and let them go 3 or 4 times in that water, so you're shaking off and diluting that acid alcohol, because as long as it's on the slide, it's still working. Now, bluing. Bluing does a very important thing besides just turn the tissue nice and blue. It also stabilizes it. Coming from the pH situation now to an alkaline situation, it stabilizes that red, gets the red out, it's blue, and it's now insoluble for everywhere you go down the staining process. Here's the thing. You can use tap water, and many people do, because tap water ranges anywhere from an acid 5.4 to a very alkaline 9.8. But since most hematoxylins are below 5.4, well below 5.4, it will still blue it. But the problem is you don't know what kind of water you've got from 1 week to the next week. I mean, it might be alkaline 1 week. It might have dropped below this 1 week. And if you put it into a more acidic pH water, it will have the tendency to do a little bit of differentiation. So you probably need to be careful of that, and that's why I say a controlled buffered bluing solution should be used instead of running water. Now, washing well after bluing is very important, because you don't want the tissue to go further down the line with a lot of alkalinity, because then that will mess up your eosin, and you will end up with a slide, and the pathologist will say the slides are smudgy looking, and they are smudgy looking. So now that was regressive. So what's a progressive stain? Remember, we said the easy definition of a progressive is you don't use a differentiator. I've got a little caveat to that to show you. Mayer's or Gill's hematoxylin are typically considered the progressive method hematoxylins of choice because they only selectively stain the nuclear material. When you come out of Mayer's, you won't, or Gill's, you won't typically have that just overall blue color. But you then place it, you'll wash it of course, you place it in blue, and it will deepen to the blue-purple color that all the pathologists like. Now there's a problem with progressive staining, and it's a problem enough that I used to hear about it at least once a week, because the complaint would be from the doctors and from you guys out there doing the work there, the histotechs, that there would be a blue background film and it just looked nasty. It appeared on the slides, and if rinsing wasn't complete, and sometimes even if it was, you still had that blue background. So remember those ionic bonds? That's what's sticking that hematoxylin to it. Now, if Harris sticks to the slide, because it's a regressive hematoxylin, you don't care because that acid alcohol is going to wipe everything out. You don't have to worry about those ionic bonds. But another issue when you're switching from a hand stain to automation. When you're hand staining and you come out of Gill's and you're doing a progressive stain, you can just dip, 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 rinse, 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 shake, shake, shake until you get all of the blue off of those slides a lot of times. When you go into an automated situation, you've only got so many dips, and they're only going to be so vigorous. So that is another complaint when you are switching from hand to automatic staining. However, there is an answer. It's something called an accentuator. You can call it a differentiator if you want. It's a mild glacial acetic acid solution, citric acid solution, buffered to stay at a certain pH. This is what you want to use because it will gently break those ionic bonds. It will not be able to break the covalent bonds in the nuclei. So you're going to keep all that nice stain. It will actually enhance it a little bit and make it a little bit nicer and more clarity, the nuclear staining. Here's a couple of sections. I didn't quite get the slide I wanted, but it's as close as I could get to it. This kind of depicts a little bit of that blue floating around here. I've seen it a lot worse. And your goblet cells are going to be much bluer than this. Now, remember we said that in the first couple of slides that the difference between a good stain and a bad stain is as simple as the pathologist reading it. There are pathologists who want this to look really blue. And if that's the case, you're probably going to do well with a Gill's hematoxylin. But there are pathologists who don't want that. So you can do well with a Gill's with an accentuator after it, or you can do well with a Harris and hydrochloric acid after it. You're going to get clear goblet cells. And it's a function of pH. So if you use Gill's, then use a mild glacial acetic acid rinse. If you use Harris, then the acid alcohol is going to clean it up for you and you don't have to worry about it. And this is more like what you're going to see. If your pathologist wants that, there is a way to get it. If he wants it blue, there is a way to get it. So basically, you know, we have to determine what our pathologists want. Some of them like heavy eosin staining, some of them like light eosin staining. Eosin is a secondary dye. Its main purpose is just to show off the nuclei and provide contrast. Now, when we do this, the eosin is an acid dye. It has a negative charge. It has an affinity for, remember when we talked about adsorption, it has to do with affinity and pH charges, and this affinity is called acidophilia. So hematoxylin, if it's too dark and really blue, your pathologist is going to say, hey, it looks too basophilic. That could be due to processing, remember, or due to the fact that we just haven't cleaned our slide up. If he says it's too acidophilic, then he's just telling you that there's too much eosin. Eosin comes in aqueous and alcoholic formulas. Just be be careful, as a rule of thumb, if you're going into aqueous eosin, use water before it because it's in a water situation. If you're going into alcoholic, use alcohol after it. As far as whether you use 95% or 100, it's up to you. If your pathologist wants his eosin toned down a little bit, cut it with a little 95%. The water will take some of it out. If he doesn't, if he likes it exactly like it comes out of there, put it in 100%. Very little will be taken out, and he'll like it better, he or she. Now, for best results, pH of 5 should be maintained. You don't want to carry over your alkaline solution, so you want to make sure it's washed good, and then it goes into alcohol and or water before your eosin. Most places, like 95%, will use alcoholic eosin. In our old lab, we used to think that if we added glacial acetic acid and lowered the pH of eosin, that it would do so much better for us. Well, it didn't, and we totally lost control of our eosin, so not a good thing to do. So we've made it now to the point where we're dehydrating. Dehydrating is one of the most critical things you do in the H&E stain. So when I get called and they say that by the time we get the slides to the pathologist, the eosin is leaching out. And a lot of people go straight to an automatic cover slipper after their stainer. It's a smart thing to do. It helps you get your slides out. Well, what has happened is water's been left on the slide and it's drawing the eosin out. Simple answer. If you are automating, if you're doing it by hand, you should be able to do it with no problem. But if you're automating, you need to raise the levels of the alcohols and xylenes after eosin. If you recall, this being the frosted edge, this is the normal level of alcohols and xylenes. That's where they would hit your slide. Well, when you go into water, it totally submerges. The slide is totally submerged. There's glass, there's water beads hanging around up here. And sometimes you put your stains up higher than other reagents, but there might be eosin beads hanging up here. So what you want to do is fill your alcohols and your xylene substitutes at the end, all the way up to the tippy top of the slide, and have it do a couple of agitations. This will make sure that when you go into the next solution, you're not carrying over those water droplets. And if you go straight to an automatic cover slipper, you're not going to carry over water droplets. Because here's a fact. If you are staining by hand or by automation, and you lift up a rack of slides out of the last xylene before it gets to be cover slip, and it looks like this, or it looks like, you know what mercury looks like when you break a thermometer and mercury just scatters all over the world in different places? When you have water on your slide coming out of xylene, it scatters all over. Xylene just scatters everywhere. If your slides don't look like this, Moses parting the sea, then you have not dehydrated your slide properly. And it's going to have a problem when it goes to the cover slip. So if it comes out of your last xylene looking like that, I call it the Rain-X effect, and you're going to have beautifully cover slip sections and no leaching of alcohol. All right, so I see that we're, oh, I got to show you this one. I see that we're winding down to about 13 minutes left, but I have to show you this. Remember we talked about deparaffинization? I was asked one time, what are these round things? These round things, I actually had to call my good friend Ada Feldman. Many of you probably know her. These round things are molecules of paraffin that have not been removed. And it's amazing how many slides you will look at and see these. And sometimes they're picked up by the pathologist and sometimes they're not. So you may want to do some QCing on some of your slides and see if you're picking any of these up, because they can cause problems. So here's just a few slides that look pretty good. I don't know, again, to me, I don't like these if I was a pathologist. I like the ones before, but your pathologist may like it. So here's our issues. We have got to please the people who read the slides and who make the diagnosis. So now we're going to start to kind of break open that formula that we talked about. These are things that I have seen over my last 15 years going in and out of labs, and prior to that too with my own problems in laboratories. I've seen rotating and changing station reagents on a whim. or how it's always been done, with no quality-based reason for doing so. Some examples. We change everything after 500 slides. Well, I say to you, you could be wasting reagent and costing yourself a fortune. We change everything after 5,000 slides. Well, you could be abusing reagents, and by the time you get to your 3,000 slide and the doctor sees it, he's not liking it. And it may be to the 4,000 slide before he says something about it. We dump everything on Friday and start fresh on Monday. Okay, you got potential waste and abuse. One week you could have 1,000 slides, the next week you could have 4,000 slides. We rotate alcohols and xylenes daily and change stains every 2 weeks. Based on what criteria, I ask you? We change everything on Monday except the hematoxin and eosin, and we top them off with fresh solution. Well, unfortunately, you're never going to know what you've got, so you can't possibly have consistency. We look at the solutions, and we know when they need changing. Well, does that vary from tech to tech, like somebody's eye is sharper than somebody else's? When the doctors notice a shift in quality, we dump it all and start fresh. Well, if you're staining my breast cancer tissue, I want you to stain it first so that it looks good. They get the best quality stain. So I say to you, isn't that a little late for some of your patient slides? Okay, so in order to maintain quality, consistency, and reproducibility, there must be a scientific, logical approach to reagent management, and it must be standardized. So as a rule, if you say that 1 ml is required to stain each slide, then a 500 ml container would produce 500 slides, just out of, reasoning. But after speaking with some experts recently, the consensus is now, because the staining solutions are much more stable and much more stronger, especially with some of the new hybrid stains, they're increasing that to 1.5 slide per ml. So that would say that we should handily be able to handle 750 slides in a 500 ml container. Now, it's pretty obvious the new hybrids can handle more slides than that. So that's kind of a basic rule to follow for the ancillary reagents that are used that are so important, that are just as important as the stain, like the alcohol, xylene substitute. So we may want to use this rule to help us determine when we would change and rotate these other reagents. Now, determining exactly how many slides your lab can successfully stain with a volume is going to take a lot of work and time, and you don't have it. So what I am recommending, as a procedure, is to find a vendor, because vendors and manufacturers work for you. They do the necessary testing and validation to support the claims that they make on their protocols. So what does this do for you? It takes the guesswork of when I need to change my reagents. Why have I got to sit around and figure out, when did I change this, and when do I change it again? Most automatic stainers have some form of reagent management system that will count slides and or racks. And by standardizing reagents in this way, that's about the best you can do to for consistency and reproducibility. So a good H&E kit can be a histotech's best friend and absolutely not your replacement. You're not that easy to replace. So I'm going to share my prescription on how to achieve consistency and reproducibility. So first, you standardize every aspect of the staining process to the best of your ability. This is our formula, knowing that some of them you just can't control, but do what you can for the collection of specimens. Definitely talk to your grossing people. Processing. Little tissue need little processing. Big tissue need lots of processing. When you embed, watch the heat. Don't burn your specimen there and ruin it. Microtomy. If it's microtomy-based situation, then fix it. Sharper blades, colder blocks, different paraffin. Staining using regimented SOPs for reagent handling. Use pre-made vendor-validated kits. Take the guesswork out of when you're going to change those products and enforce your SOPs. Don't Don't do it on Monday and forget it on Tuesday. Do it every single day. Now, you need to choose your source for your stains and other reagents like bluing and acid alcohol, etc. Do they offer standardized staining solutions? Can they please the eyes of at least the majority of your doctors? Sometimes if you've got 10 or 12 doctors, you cannot please the eyes of all of them. But if you can please the eyes of most of them, that's what you're looking for. Do they offer technical support? Do they stand behind their products and offer solutions when you have a problem? I spent 13 years doing that. Is the whole process affordable for your budget, taking into consideration the relief your staff will get with a happy pathologist and not spending time correcting poor staining? Do it right up front, and your turnaround time will improve and the quality of your patient care will improve. So, and when I was helping someone figure out what they wanted their stain to look like, sometimes it's a good idea to just say, hey, give us some tissue, let us throw some stains against it, you tell us, you know, which one you like best, and there are many more combinations other than this, and we'll take different tissues that you process, and we'll help you figure out, you know, you want a vendor that will do that for you. And then, last one here, you want to put it into practice. And this is kind of what I recommended. This is just an example, like in a particular lab. We're going to rotate our xylene and alcohol every 500 or maybe now 750 slides. We're going to change our differentiation solution every 1,000 slides. We're going to blue. We're going to change that every 1,000 slides. And we're going to look at our manufacturer's suggested threshold of how often we should change our hematoxylin eosin. We're not going to top it off. We're going to change it when we have reached our threshold level. And we're going to keep all these guys up front and all these guys afterwards in tip-top condition. And you know what? When we do this, and everybody gets the hang of it, they're going to like it a lot better. The pathologist is going to be happy. You're going to be proud because you did it. And, you know, you're just going to, your turnaround time is going to improve. So actually, that's pretty much what I had to say today, and I apologize. I've gone into some of these hospitals here, and I can tell you that they went to the trouble of getting it right, and these folks get the same slide day after day after day after day. But it all starts a long way away from the H&E stain. And I just want to tell you that I am so proud that I spent so many years as a histotechnologist. It is one of the best careers in the world, and I applaud every one of you out there.